As the lake kept giving, the people kept coming. With her newfound popularity, massive changes began to take place. Urban growth, land use practices, the introduction of non-native fish, municipal and industrial discharge have impaired water quality and severely altered the lake's ecosystem.
Most human civilizations are basically built around water bodies, right? They're a great transportation unit. They provide resources, water, and food. And I think what's basically happened is, as the human pressure has been built up more and more and more around the lake, all kinds of things happen. Irrigation is a big thing, right? I mean, we basically take a lot of water out of the river, we run it over the ground to irrigate the crops, and then it goes back into the lake. What that does is it brings dirt with it, or sediments, which makes the lake turbid. It brings the phosphorus and nitrogen and all the things that the farmers put on the water to the land to fertilize it, and that basically causes algae to bloom. You've got things like Geneva steel that operated for years and years there. It's unclear how much stuff went into the lake from them. You know, and all these things are necessary for civilization. I'm not saying this is the fault of the farmers. I'm just saying that the way we approach things historically is to get the easiest, fastest fix we can, and then the ramifications come down the road. And we're always faced with trying to fix something that broke a long time ago.
When the pioneers first arrived, they found that to enable them to raise crops, they had to irrigate. And they began taking water out of the Provo River right away. In the spring, when the sucker and the trout spawned, it was not irrigation time yet, and the fish were able to go up the river and spawn. The ones who weren't caught by the fishermen with their nets across the mouth of the river during spawning season went up and spawned. But then when the fry, small fry, began coming back down the river, it was irrigation season, and temporary dams had been put in, and water from Provo River was diverted out onto the farmland, and thousands, right from the very first, thousands and thousands of fish were wasted every year by being caught high and dry on farmers' fields when the irrigation water was shut off. The earliest government map that was done of the Provo area showed Provo River being a braided river. In places it looked just like the fingers coming off a hand, especially at the base of the Orem Bench, where the highway comes down from Orem into Provo now. It was just braided with streams from the Provo River. But the problem was in heavy water years, when a large flow came down the river, being so many small streams in that area, it tended to flood, and a lot of the water came right down Fifth West and flooded out the town. And so they needed to begin channelizing that area fairly early to keep the water within its bounds.
With the linking of the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific Railroads, the West blossomed with hope and opportunity. Tradesmen of all varieties, hotel tycoons, bankers, restaurateurs, and countless other professionals descended upon Utah Lake seeking a better life and to reap the rewards promised by the area's booming population.
In May 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad was completed in Utah. Now goods could be brought in to the territory. They could also be shipped out of the territory. In 1874, a branch line into Utah County was completed. That made it possible now to build a woolen mill powered by the Provo River, a mill race coming out of the Provo River. Unfortunately, the mill led to a little more pollution in Utah Lake, because every time they dyed the wool, the excess dye was just tapped off down the mill stream. And so some days you'd have a blue mill stream, some days you'd have a red, some days you'd have a green.
About the same time, sugar mills began depositing waste from the processing of sugar beets into the tributaries of the lake and the Jordan River. Sawmills were guilty too.
People began building sawmills up canyons, and rather than pay people to haul off the sawdust, they decided that it would be just as easy to throw it in the stream that powered the mill. The territorial legislature eventually began to worry about losing the trout population and passed laws that forbade the mill owners from disposing of their sawdust into the waters contiguous to the mill. They also passed laws making it necessary for farmers to screen the irrigation ditches, which kept a large number of fish from perishing on the fields. And another law, any new dam that went in, a fish ladder needed to be constructed adjacent to that dam so fish could spawn up the Provo River and some of the smaller tributaries by climbing the fish ladder and continuing on up the stream.
Progress occurred swiftly and without thought of future consequences to Utah Lake and the human population around it. The steel industry found a home near Utah Lake in the 1920s, beginning with Columbia Steel, which later became Geneva Steel, built just a short distance away from where Geneva Resort once stood. Along with the height of steel production came the peak of pollution. In the 1940s and 1950s, most large steel makers were oblivious to environmental issues.
One of the big polluters of the lake has been the Geneva Steel Mill that was built in the 1940s. At first there wasn't a lot of machinery in place to keep the polluted water from flowing into Utah Lake. The University of Utah did a study, I think it was in the late 40s, early 50s. Now at that time, almost all of the communities in Utah Valley put their raw sewage directly into Provo Bay and Utah Lake. And yet this study done by the University of Utah showed that the steel mill polluted the lake more than all of the open sewage from all of the communities around the lake flowing into it.
As recently as the 1950s, raw sewage was also being emptied into Utah Lake and its tributaries, which created public alarm, especially with the polio outbreak in Provo. Wastewater treatment facilities were quickly built and put into operation. But in the minds of those who enjoyed the lake in years past, this was no longer a safe place to swim, fish, or boat.
We would still swim in the lake, but we were very cautious about where we went to swim. In the 50s, it was about the time when they started to think about sewage treatment plants and actually doing something about the wastes that were going into the lake. And I do believe, from the standpoint of waste going into the lake, we have come a long, long way.
For a long time, people failed to recognize what some of their practices were doing to Utah Lake and its fragile ecosystem. It wasn't until the Clean Water Act was passed in the early 1970s that the tide began to turn and environmental regulations came into play. Later, in the 1990s, Geneva Steel undertook a massive cleanup effort on Utah Lake. Millions of dollars went towards efforts to revitalize the area around the lake and improve water quality. But negative perceptions of Utah Lake's condition lingered. Despite all that has been taken from her and the transformation she has undergone, Utah Lake has endured. The lake and the surrounding valley have survived and even flourished in some ways since humans first arrived on her shores.
I grew up in Orem, just off Main Street, in the center of town. At that point in time, you could walk outside of your house and go pheasant hunting or do whatever you wanted to do, and there were very few houses around. In fact, I could walk to Utah Lake without ever encountering another home.
A lot of the heavy industry has left the county now, and so they're not polluting the lake. It's us that are polluting the lake.
I think that there are a lot of people that are frustrated with the growth they're seeing in our community kind of taking over everything. And they're starting to say that there are things they don't want to see taken over. And one of those is the lake.
As population and economic growth were booming in most parts of Utah Valley, impacts to the lake began to be more visible. Very often, change is good, But when non-native fish such as carp were introduced to replace the dwindling cutthroat trout, the results weren't good at all.
The Utah Lake ecosystem's been altered substantially since settlers came to the area. Historically, Utah Lake had 13 native fish species. We had a number of things that we don't have today. The balance that was there at the time the settlers arrived was disrupted because of all the impacts.
Of the 13 native fish that originally lived in Utah Lake, only 2 remain, the June sucker and the Utah sucker. These constitute less than 1% of the overall fish community. Beginning in the 1880s, many exotic and non-native species were introduced to the lake. Some, like eels and clams, did not survive. Others, such as the common carp, which make up an estimated 90% of the lake's biomass, continue to have devastating effects on the lake's ecosystem.
We found the lake trout had done poorly because of the low and consequently muddy water. And then the carp, which have thriven immensely, have eaten off the mosses and similar growth along the bottom of the lake, so that the trout have not had enough to eat. Carp are a good deal like the English sparrow. Once they get into a place, they are there to stay. E.A. Tullian, Superintendent of the United States Fish Commission, 1901.
Historically, there was quite a lot of vegetation that occurred in the lake and around the shorelines. And since the introduction of carp into Utah Lake, their foraging habits and such has basically eliminated the aquatic vegetation from the lake and increased the turbidity throughout the lake.
There are as many perceptions of Utah Lake as there are Utahns, and people continue to ask many things of one body of water. It is a popular recreation spot, a sought-after water resource, a magnet for economic boom. So after thousands of years of existence, it seems Utah Lake must continue to be all things to all people. But is this grand dame of the Intermountain West up to the task? What is her ideal use? How can she best serve the communities that rely on her?